everyone. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Natan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor a podcast episode in honor or in memory of a loved one, please contact the Natan office or email us at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One podcast, where we spend 30 minutes speaking about the Parsha. Our episodes in the book of Bereishit focus on family and interpersonal dynamics. These conversations are candid, insightful, and respectful. We aim not to psychoanalyze the biblical figures, but to learn from them as we stumble through our own beautifully messy lives. This week's episode has been dedicated by Michelle Feiglin and Debbie Nossbaum in honor of their father's 7th yartzeit, Natan ben Shlomo Elimelech. Nathan Werdiger, as he was known, was a Holocaust survivor who came to Australia by himself, built up a large family and business, and always maintained his strong faith in Torah learning. He was an incredible role model for his family, optimistic, loving, a big Baal tzedakah, and had a deep love for Eretz Yisrael. He made every person feel special and always took interest in each grandchild, great-grandchild, and their spouses. May his neshama have an aliyah. Parshat Vayechi chronicles Yaakov's preparations for death. These preparations open with his request from Yosef that he be buried in Canaan and continues with the blessings of his 2 grandsons, a scene which has a potential to end disastrously, like Yaakov and Esav's blessing mix-up, but thankfully doesn't. Yaakov then calls on all of his sons to deliver what is often called the Testament of Yaakov, mostly blessings he bestows upon his children with many hints to their future tribal realities. Yaakov dies, and mourning practices are observed both according to Egyptian and Israelite tradition. After this, the brothers have their final interaction with Yosef, a painful moment in time we explored a bit in last week's episode. And finally, Yosef himself passes away at the age of 110. Poignantly, the final words of the book of Bereishit is Mitzrayim, which connects us to the initial setting of the book of Shemot. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Rabbi Alex Israel, who is a teacher and scholar of Tanakh at Natan, Yeshivat Eretz Tzvi, midrashic Lindenbaum, and directs programming at the Parshat Institute of Jewish Studies. His books, 1 Kings, Torn in Two, and 2 Kings, In a Whirlwind, have been received with great acclaim. His writings may be found at www.alexisrael.org. Rav Alex has also recently launched his Tanakh podcast, which follows the daily 9-to-9 learning schedule called the Tanakh Podcast, which can be found on all major podcasting platforms. Rav Alex, it's great to have you here again.
It's great to be here, Yosefa. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I didn't say you were a returning guest, but last you were on to speak about the Nazir in the book of Bamidbar. So it's great to be back here to speak about family and to really close this series looking at these final sections in the book of Bereishit.
That is true. That is true. And one of the things that I wanted to raise is actually not just the relationship between Yaakov and his sons, which is so prominent through Parshat Vayechi, but an idea that was actually spoken about at a Shalom Zachar for our recently born grandson, where the great uncle of the new little baby spoke about the idea that Yaakov is the first of the Avot who we really see as a grandparent. We see him blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, and later on we read in the Parsha that Yosef clearly learns from him, because we have this idea of Vayar Yosef leEphraim b'nei Shileshim, not only a grandparent but a great-grandparent, Gam b'nei Machir ben Manasseh yuldu al Berkei Yosef, at the end of the Parsha, the notion of great-grandchildren. And he suggested something really interesting. He said that maybe Yaakov is the first of the Avot that relates to his grandchildren, because Yaakov is the first of the Avot who actually had a Jewish grandfather. He himself experienced being a grandchild. And in fact, Chazal even talk about the idea that Esav and Yaakov stayed on the derech, or Esav stayed, as long as Abraham was alive, they had respect for their grandfather. And for the first 15 years of their life, they experienced being a grandchild. And it's interesting that Yaakov seems to invest in his grandchildren.
You know, there's two quick thoughts I have on that point. The first is the potential power that grandparents have to wield influence over their grandchildren. I feel like grandparents, it's an option, meaning grandparents can choose the role they want to have in their grandchildren's lives. They don't have the same potential to harm, thankfully, that parents do for their children, but grandparents really have that decision. How much do they want to be present? How much are they going to be essential in their grandchildren's lives? And the second piece is that I think, interestingly, and this I say, from the parent raising children perspective, which is that when Yosef encounters his father with his grandchildren in the surrounding, he tries to get involved, right? He doesn't like the way that the grandparent is functioning with the grandchildren. You're messing up here, right? You are sort of unknowingly about to pass on to my children something that was quite complicated in your life. Which was
don't mix up the older with the younger. This is toxic. This is explosive. Leave it out of my family.
Exactly. And I just want to say that from a real life perspective, and we won't go here any more than this, which is that's a tension sometimes between parents and grandparents, meaning the parents of the child, that is a real life thing of you see grandparents functioning a certain way. How much do you let them do their thing? How much do you get involved? And I think that it's really brilliant that it actually comes up in the moment that he meets Yaakov in the surroundings with Ephraim and Menashe in this week's Parsha.
And there's a gorgeous comment of the Ramban when Yosef brings his sons to be blessed by Yaakov. That he hears that Hinei avicha choleh, and he knows his father's sick, and he particularly brings the grandchildren. And Ramban says, Ki levarech Yosef b'havato oto birech banav, that if he wants to give a real blessing to Yosef, it's to embrace and to bless his grandchildren. And that as parents, we actually want our parents to be interested in our children. We want to keep that intergenerational connection alive. And that's the greatest blessing to Yosef, that Yaakov should bless his children.
And also sometimes for parents, if they've had a more complex relationship with their children, a lot of times the repair can happen actually in their relationship with their grandchildren. A lot of times the love they could show, that's how I kind of read the midrash, the love they can show for their grandchildren can sometimes provide a better version or an evolved version of the relationship they were able to craft with their own child.
Right, fascinating.
So that's one prism really of this week's Parsha, is you
Certainly.
Can't really ignore the shifting of the generations.
That is true. So when we look at our Parsha, I love it. The Parsha is called Vayechi. Vayechi Yaakov. Yaakov lived, but really in so many ways, this Parsha is a long death scene.
Slow unraveling.
A series of death scenes. In the first segment in Perek Mem Zayin, Yaakov has an audience with Yosef and asks him, don't bury me in Egypt, take me to Eretz Israel. Then he has his goodbye to Yosef's children. That's chapter 48. Then chapter 49, he blesses every single one of his children, one by one. And in the end, Vayigva v'ye'asef el amav. Interestingly, for the other avot, it says Vayigva v'yamot. And with Yaakov, it just says Vayigva v'yasef el amav, and as a result of which, the rabbis say Yaakov Avinu lo met. Yep. Yaakov didn't die in some way. Maybe we'll relate to that in a few minutes. So funny, the man who spends the longest time in the Bible dying, they say he didn't die.
He doesn't even get to die in the end.
Anyway, whatever that means, we'll talk about it. But there's something really fascinating that Chazal say about Yaakov, and we have this sense of Hinei avicha choleh, that Yaakov is the first person who becomes sick. In fact, the rabbis dramatized it in a typical midrashic way and said, people used to just sneeze and die, but Yaakov actually asked to die slowly. He asked to become sick. And I love the midrash from which this is taken. It's back in the story of Avraham Zaken ba b'yamim. And the midrash says that each of the three avot asked for different things of their old age or approaching death. Avraham tavazikna. Avraham wanted old age. Avraham said, how can it be that I step into the room with my son and nobody knows who is the father and who is the son? Avraham wanted the dignity of old age. He wanted to be the patriarch of a clan. He wanted to be the godfather of the family, the figurehead. Yitzchak tavayisurin. Yitzchak went into death actually wanting to suffer, strangely enough. Yitzchak said, Ribon kol ha'olamim, Adam מת בלא ייסורים, מידת הדין מתוחה כנגדו. If a person dies without suffering, then he won't have penance. He won't have cleansed himself of his sins in this world. I want to go to the next world having suffered everything and go to Olam Haba with this sort of clean slate.
By the way, I can only read into that the Akedah, meaning he once came very close to death and wasn't able to prepare for it at all from a spiritual perspective. So I think Chazal are reading that very deeply into here, meaning this is already a man who's come very close to death once.
That is very deep. So Yitzchak is looking for this sense of purity and he's looking to be absolved of his sins, and he hopes that all of his suffering in old age will somehow help him somewhere along the way. It's not suffering, the suffering that leads to his death won't just evaporate and be meaningless. It will be meaningful and it will cleanse him, and he wants to die clean of sin. Yaakov tava et hacholi. Yaakov really wanted to get sick. Why? He says, Adam מת בלא חולי. If somebody dies without getting sick, אינו מיישב בין בניו. Which is an interesting question. He can't settle between his sons. Now, does Yaakov need to settle with his sons? Does he need to cleanse the friction between his sons? But Yaakov wants to plan his death. He wants to choreograph his death. He wants to have everything said. He wants to leave a letter for every single person. And I find this remarkable because it's so Yaakov. Yaakov is the quintessential planner. Yaakov doesn't like surprises. Yaakov is the one who sort of tries to manipulate behind the scenes his relationship with his brother, buying the birthright, not that it particularly helps him, trying to steal the brachot, and he always wants to, with Lavan also, he thinks he can make a contract with Lavan. He makes a business deal, and yet Lavan outsmarts him 10 times, and then he busy outsmarts him. When he makes his approach to Esav, he tries to plan and send gifts. And frequently Yaakov is surprised. He gets surprised by the switching of Leah instead of Rachel. He gets surprised by being pinned down by an angel and wakes up in the morning sort of like rubbing his head or rubbing his thigh, and suddenly Esav's there and he's unprepared. Yaakov always wants to prepare, and he never manages to. And Yaakov almost says, well, if there's one thing I'd like to prepare for, let me be sick so that it's not a surprise. Let me be sick so that I can say everything that needs to be said.
I think it also presents very poignantly, I'm thinking in basketball terms because I'm a basketball player, but while he always likes to plan, he's always been on the defense, okay? He's never really been able to foresee things in a way that was truly masterful. And so he found himself constantly being hit, right? That was the Shu bikesh l'shevet v'shalva, and he's never able to. He's wanted to be able to have sort of that bird's eye view, and it hasn't happened for him. And I sort of feel like the Midrash presents him and says, at least for my death, let me be masterful about it. And I think that image about creating peace between my son, well, it's because Yaakov realizes that it's the unfinished business, right? And we see even when he dies, by the way, that Midrash is great proof for the fact that the brothers don't lie when they go to Yosef and say, our father said you should continue to support us, right? Because if he was really trying to make peace between his sons, he'll want to have them sort of coexist as long as possible. But ultimately, whether that is achieved or not is its own question about the relationship between the brothers. But we really see Yaakov struggling with the fact that his life in many moments sort of felt like it was unraveling or sort of attacked him. And here he says, at least in my death, let me be able to do it well in the presence of everybody where there's clear communication, right? There's some sort of overall planning. So I read that very powerfully into his life.
What I love about this Midrash is that we watch older generations approach the end of their life, and it's fascinating what is on people's, some people are holding desperately onto life.
Yeah.
Some people, the way they want to, look at their families. Avram says, I want the dignity of old age. Yitzchak says, my old age might be tough, but I hope it purifies me. Mm-hmm. And Yaakov is actually planning out the future.
Yeah. He's looking to accomplish something in his old age.
He's looking forward. It's an amazing thing that Yaakov, there are all these different midrashim about Yaakov talking to his family and saying to God, thank God that my mitati shlema or whatever it is. Yaakov, what Rabbi Sachs calls the rejection of rejection. Yaakov, even though his sons are not perfect, he even curses some of his sons on his deathbed. And yet everybody is in. Mm-hmm. Everybody, the Chacham and the Rasha and the Tam and the She'enu Yodea Lishol, all the 12 tribes, with all of their difference and all of their diversity, with their flaws, their warts and all, right? With the tensions, because there is in every family, right? And yet, this is the beginning of Klal Yisrael. That sense of the totality, the 12 tribes. There's something very powerful. And maybe because there is this great diversity, one needs to liyashev ben banav. One needs to find some way. But Yaakov's almost determined that this will be the end of the rejection of rejection, that this is the beginning of the Klal.
If I can go back to the point that you opened our conversation with, was about the first grandparent, so to speak, or the first with the awareness of having a grandparent. You know, I think about Avraham, because he didn't have a tradition to draw upon, he was very focused, as you brought in the midrash, but I think also in the psukim, he's very focused with the vision of what the future has. And Yaakov, because he has sort of tradition of grandparent to look back on, he's very much trying to sort of focus on how to map out what's been going on. There's more factors at play for Yaakov than there was for Avram, so to speak, or certainly than there was for Yitzchak. And so this need to plan or to address every child is that he's really fraught with awareness of what he's created. You know, again, Avram's at the beginning, so it's just the beginning of a process. And Yaakov is coming in as sort of a much richer place and has provided many more branches on this tree. So I think that also, you know, he has there's more responsibility on his plate, I think, than the patriarchs who come before him.
I wanted to move to a further topic, which is the way that Yaakov's vision doesn't only look forward, but Yaakov's vision looks back. And we all have these verses that we so well know, HaMalach HaGoel Oti Mikol Ra, we sing it to our children, Yovarech et Hanarim, the angel who redeemed me from all evil. He should bless these children, V'shem Avotai, Avraham v'Yitzchak. So first of all, it's a remarkable thing that he tells his grandchildren, I want you to bear the legacy of Avraham, Yitzchak, and me. That's just phenomenal education, a phenomenal sense of where you come from. But I noticed that when we look at this, HaMalach HaGoel Oti Mikol Ra, Yaakov is looking back at his life. He interacted with angels quite a bit. We all remember the dreams with angels, the fighting with angels, the meeting angels. And he says, there was an angel who protected me from every evil. Now, here's the fascinating thing. In just last week's Parshat, we saw that Yaakov met with Pharaoh, and it was just 17 years earlier. And he says, Paro says, how old are you? And he says, I'm 130. Ma'at v'ra'im hayu yemei shenei chayai. I've had a short life and a bitter life. Ma'at v'ra'im. I've had an awful life, right? I went from Esav to Lavan, back to Esav, to Dinah and Shechem, to the Yosef. It's been one heck of a nightmare. And now he's been living with his family in some sense of unity in Egypt, maybe in the lap of luxury, royalty, for 17 years. And now he turns around to his grandchildren and he says, HaMalach HaGoel Oti Mikol Ra. Not Ma'avara'im, not my life was bad and short. He says, oh, you know what? I had an angel who helped me get through all those bad moments. As opposed to 17 years earlier, where he maybe was still reeling from his 22 years of mourning for Yosef, his perspective has shifted and he sees the divine guidance. He knows he had tribulations, but he says, you know what? There was always an angel with me, protecting me. And I just think that retrospective look, which has sort of like changed the past, he seems to have changed his perspective. In his old age, he looks at life differently, and actually in a more positive way than he was willing to see 17 years ago. And I find that, if we're talking about end of life, approaching death, there's the notion of crafting the legacy of the family, but he's actually changed the way he looks at his whole autobiography. That
thought brings up two thoughts in me. The first is that We spoke in earlier episodes about how Yosef adopts a different theological perspective, that one of the ways that he deals with or sort of comes to terms with the fate that he's met is that he says, it's true, my brother's meant to do pretty bad to me. I don't need to forgive them or put that on the side. But ultimately, God had a plan for me. And I almost feel as if, and this is also a real phenomenon that happens, I almost feel as if I feel almost as if Yosef's theological reframe has almost rubbed off on Yaakov here. Meaning sometimes that happens to parents, that they learn from their own children. And of course, we don't have an interaction between them where we know that happened, but that's sort of an intuitive read on my part, that after all this time, he's sort of said, look, if my son, who went through this very difficult thing, was able to reframe, maybe I can reframe as well. And all of those interactions with those angels, which sometimes were threatening or difficult or left me crippled, are something that actually was guiding me along this time. And the other piece that it brings up for me is, so there's this great book. It's called Happier Endings by Erica Brown. And it was her sort of a year-long project where she sort of explored how people die better. And she, at some point in the book, and I think it's in the beginning, she really takes issue, so to speak, with the accepted stages, or so to speak, stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, all these different stages. And I'll also just add, by the way, that anybody who's interested in this topic should really look at David Kessler's work. He was the main student of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he wrote a book called Finding Meaning, or something of that sort, where he sort of says that she never meant these stages to be prescriptive and has important things to say about that. But she says as follows, Erica Brown. She says, the last most potent stage or development within the framework of loss is not acceptance, it's inspiration. I humbly believe that Kubler-Ross missed something in her categorization, and that may be the key to the fine art of dying well, if we can ever truly call it that. And she says, once someone is able to utter these words, I need to be prepared, which is for me, is Yaakov, right? That's what he said from the midrash. A flood of change takes place that enables us to face death without fear. This is the stage I call inspiration, a stage that never appears in Kubler-Ross's framework, but appears in virtually every conversation I had with a person or family who managed to do death better. The intentional decision to become better prepared for death gives the dying permission to love more fully, to say the words they wanted to say for a lifetime, to repair and heal troubled relationships, and to entertain a range of ethereal and spiritual thoughts and actions previously closed off, sealed, or masked by the pragmata of everyday anxieties. And I'll just add that I think about that when I think about this reframe that you brought about for Yaakov, because it almost feels like Yaakov has truly accepted his death. He's moved into that stage of inspiration. And because of that, he's seeing things differently. He's literally reframing his life, looking at his children in ways sometimes more empathic, sometimes less so. But he's looking at his children also through a different frame.
Right. I find it fascinating, your first point, that he's affected by Yosef's theology, because I'd actually looked at it slightly differently, and I thought to myself, when you're in the thick of misery, it really affects you and everything looks dark. Mm-hmm. But when you get a bit of space in life, you can, frequently, you just find, the light shining. So, maybe there is something in that Yaakov got a little bit of relief for the first time. That shalva that he was looking for in the last 17 years of his life. And sometimes gaining that space, sometimes getting that breathing room enables you to have a more positive perspective.
Totally. Of course, the only thorn in his side was his location of living. But other than that, sure. I agree. These are his most peaceful years that we've ever seen in his life.
Right. So the final point that I think it might be worthwhile talking about is the notion of legacy. Because Yaakov doesn't only just bless his sons, organize the family, or reflect backwards, but he leaves us with certain things. The opening lines of the Parsha, I think, are very powerful, because he calls Yosef, and he talks to him in a very dignified way. He's almost talking to Yosef as the leader of Mitzrayim, the man who has the power. And he makes him take an oath, Simla yadcha tachet yirechi, and he says, Al na tikbareni b'Mitzrayim. Don't bury me in Egypt. It's phrased in the negative. Later on, he talks about kever machpelah, but here he talks in the very, very negative sense, not Egypt. Rabbi Hirsch says, Jacob had lived 17 years with his family in Egypt, and he must have noticed what a powerful influence the Vayechi Zuba, the last words of the previous Parsha, were beginning to have on his descendants, how they had already begun to see the Jordan in the Nile and to find their stay in Egypt no exile. Sufficient motive this for him to press with such ceremonious solemnity that they should not bury him in Egypt, but they should carry him to the land of their old true homeland. Motive enough for him to say, you hope and wish to live in Egypt, I do not wish to even be buried there. Quite a powerful statement. Yaakov ends his life in Egypt, and yet at the same time, he is one of the avot where the foundational promises of Zerah and Aretz. He's got the Zerah, he wants to make sure his family make it back. I always find it fascinating that to the brothers, he doesn't give this negative message, Al natik bareni b'Mitzrayim. He says, kivroti, the kivrot abotai. And it's interesting that out of all of the brothers, out of all of the 12 sons, the only one who similarly makes the same request, I don't want to be buried in Egypt, take my bones out of here, is Yosef. He's the man who held, interesting questions sometimes. What is more powerful? Negative messaging or positive messaging? If I come along and say, we love Eretz Yisrael, or I say, no way are we going to stay here in Galut. Yaakov says, Al natik bareni b'Mitzrayim, to Yosef, the man who is the most acculturated to Egypt.
Yeah,
Yosef gets the message. Mm-hmm. He gets the message, and these are the ending lines of the Parsha where Yosef tells his brothers, Anochi meit ve'Elohim pakod yifkod etchem ve'ela etchem min ha'aretz. I'm going to die. God is going to redeem you and take you out of this land, the land which was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he made them take an oath, saying, Ha'alitem et atzmotai mizeh. And this phrase, Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem, he doesn't only make them promise to take his bones out, he almost makes them swear that they will believe in Pakod yifkod. They will believe in redemption. This language comes back at the sneh, where God says, Pakod pakadati. I have visited you. I have come true on my historic promises, on the Brit, on the covenant. This belief in redemption, along with this, don't bury me here, don't let me rest here. And the last thing the Jews do as they leave Egypt is to take Moshe takes Yosef's bones, ki hashpea hishbia b'nei Yisrael, because he made them swear, saying, Pakod pakadati. Yaakov leaves a huge legacy. But one legacy he leaves is that we can't stay. We can't stay in Galut, that ultimately we won't be home till we come to Eretz Yisrael. And this raises sort of very important questions about where we belong. But I think even beyond that, it raises really interesting questions about what legacies, if we want to broaden this out, what legacies we get from our parents. What legacies we get, are they deliberate? Are they subliminal, right? Sometimes somebody gets something from their parents or grandparents just because that's the way they acted, not because they ever said it, right? And are, positive messaging, negative messaging. I'm going to do this because it's the opposite of what my mother did. Or I'm going to do this because that was my father's tradition, right? What legacies do we bear?
To go back to the interpersonal piece between Yaakov and Yosef, so it's interesting because, first of all, we see that in this way, Yaakov and Yosef to their death remained more intertwined than Yaakov and the other children in that regard. I think it really sort of memorializes the deep connection between them.
Almost an intimacy.
Yeah, a real intimacy, an intimacy of vision, intimacy of how we see ourselves resting in this world and the next. I think that that's a very deep connection between them. And then I was asking myself as you were speaking, why does he go to Yosef? So I agree with you. He goes to Yosef to ask him because he knows he's the guy in charge. And he knows that probably taking a body out of Egypt was not culturally accepted. As you could see if you read really carefully into the first half of the last chapter in Sefer Bereishit, fascinating lesson on how to maintain a dual identity in the diaspora. But I think that beyond that, of all of the brothers, Yosef was brought to Egypt. You said he was the multicultural, which is true, but he's the only one brought to Egypt against his will. The other brothers choose to come there. Again, choosing is a complicated term, okay? But the other brothers choose to come there, and Yosef is brought there against his will. And because Yosef has worked so hard while being completely within the Egyptian system to maintain his identity as being, to a certain degree, Israelite, or a certain loyalty to his Israelite identity, I feel that Yaakov sees him as a co-patriot, whereas the brothers, they've never pretended to culture into the Egyptian world, meaning they live separately. They live in their own space. And so he might even, again, this is a total conjecture, but he might even look at Yosef not only as the powerful one who can wield and make his wish come true, but he has a real understanding of how you can get sucked in, but still manage to not get sucked into that culture. So I feel like it also reflects a real respect that Yaakov has for the way Yosef evolved, being who he is in that society.
Fascinating, really fascinating.
But I think that general question, we'll just leave it as an open one of the legacies that we give to our children. I'll just say, maybe on a personal note, that my parents bought plots years ago in the States to be buried in, and it was with some relatives, and that was that. And then I guess at this point it was like 8 years back, they were sort of doing a Groupon for plots here in Israel through.
Didn't know you could do Groupons
through my parents' shul. And speaking about being intentional, my father actually asked permission from my 2 older siblings if it would be okay if they move their burial plots to Israel, because it would incur travel and more inconvenience on their part. Obviously, my permission he didn't need to ask, both ideologically and technically. And in fact, they bought it. Sadly, it was used quicker than had been imagined on the part of my father. But what I wanted to say is that I was moved by that whole situation. Never in my life have I ever tried to share my ideological parts and feelings, which are big parts of me. I've never tried to send them back on my family. I don't function like that. I'm also the youngest. I think it's connected. But I was moved by that shift that happened subtly, apparently, from my parents' perspective of where's the place they want to be. And I know that that's something that resonates no matter where everybody chooses to live. It resonates really deeply for all those who come and visit, meaning coming to visit here says something about somebody's values. So this whole question about where one gets buried and where it's important for you, I agree with you. We can remove it from the Israel diaspora context. I don't think it just exists there, but that even in our decisions about certainly how we die, but also where we die, what messages those send for all of those who are going to come visit and think about us after we're no longer here.
That's a really valid point. So since you shared a story, I'll share something from my grandfather.
Yes.
And I'll just say that, it's really interesting, the legacies we bear. I learned a lot from my grandfather, and Baruch Hashem, he lived till almost 100 years old, and I had wonderful experience with him. But I will still remember as a little boy, he used to pick me up every Sunday morning. I think my parents wanted me out of the house. They wanted a morning off. I used to go with my grandfather to Shacharit, and then I used to go back to his house and learn with him. And one thing I remember, he always used to, Shacharit was at 8:15, he used to listen to the 8 o'clock news, and he was always waiting outside the house at 8:05, and on the way to shul, he always used to say his Birchot HaShachar to himself, Baal Peh. And the funny thing is, I always say my Birchot HaShachar on the way to shul. As I'm walking to shul, I don't say it at home, I don't say it in shul, I say my Birchot HaShachar on the way to shul, and I always think of my grandfather on a regular basis. And it's really interesting, the legacies we take from previous generations, small things which somehow are this very meaningful thread which tie us through the generations.
Totally. So, I just wanted to close today's episode with, we really are closing our series on Sefer Bereishit. We explored so many different angles of family and interpersonal dynamics, siblings, relatives, superiors, and of course, aging parents. These conversations have touched upon personal moments and life themes, and I'm so grateful to all of our guests for coming on and sharing their Torah thoughts and life wisdom. I want to thank all of our listeners for reaching out over these past number of episodes. This series has produced significant more feedback and communication than others, I'm certain because of its more personal nature, and it has been moving to receive each and every one of these communications. Please continue to reach out. I always try my best to respond. I opened the Bereishit episodes with my favorite passage from Rabbi Sachs's Torah commentary in his introduction to Bereishit. Before moving on to the national stage, the Torah laid before us an entire book that details our human shortcomings, what Dr. Yael Ziegler called the human traits we are called upon to overcome. Jealousy, rivalry, pettiness are just some of the traits that get in the way of our personal relationships. What Rabbi Sachs explained is that we must do this personal work in order to become successful on the big stage as a nation and God's people. In this light, our next series in the book of Shemot focuses on identity and nationality formation. Through our usual textual focus and sensitivity, we want these episodes to explore some of the following big questions. How does a group of slaves transform into God's chosen people? What long-lasting import and meaning does the Sinai experience offer us now? What is its role in the formation of the people then and now? The concept of covenant and its centrality to Judaism. Why the Mishkan? What is its role in our national spiritual lives? What biblical ideas about nation forming are influential in the political, in the broad sense, sphere today? And finally, God appears to Moshe and the people in several different forms and through varied personality traits throughout the book of Shemot. How does this relate to our current lives and our avodat Hashem, our worship of God? Throughout these conversations, I will think and challenge our guests to anchor these big ideas in our practical lives. What does all of this mean for us now? How can I carry the book of Shemot with me in my hands and in my heart? Stay tuned for this next series of candid and hopefully moving conversations. And as always, please make sure to share these episodes with friends and family. Rav Alex, thank you for being here.
Thank you for hosting me.
And the Shabbat Shalom to everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Natan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Matan's website. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in the comments. Please send us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.